Little House on the Prairie series by Laura Ingalls Wilder. Book 2, Little House on the Prairie. Chapter 4, Prairie Day. Soft whickerings were close to Laura's ear, and grain rattled in the feed box. Pa was giving Pet and Patty their breakfast.
"Back, Pet. Don't be so greedy,"
he said.
"You know it's Patty's turn."
Pet stamped her foot and nickered.
"Now, Patty, keep your own end of the box,"
said Pa.
"This is for Pet."
Then a little squeal from Patty.
"Ha! Got nipped, didn't you?"
Pa said.
"And serve you right. I told you to eat your own corn."
Mary and Laura looked at each other and laughed. They could smell bacon and coffee and hear pancakes sizzling, and they scrambled out of bed. Mary could dress herself, all but the middle button. Laura buttoned that one for her. Then Mary buttoned Laura all the way up the back. They washed their hands and faces in the tin wash basin on the wagon step. Ma combed every snarl out of their hair, while Pa brought fresh water from the creek. Then they sat on the clean grass and ate pancakes and bacon and molasses from the tin plates in their laps. All around them, shadows were moving over the wavering grasses while the sun rose. Meadowlarks were springing straight up from the billows of grass into the high, clear sky, singing as they went. Small pearly clouds drifted in the immense blueness overhead. In all the weed tops, tiny birds were singing and swinging and using their tiny voices. Pa said that they were dickasils. "Dicky, Dicky," Laura called back to them. "Dicky bird." "Eat your breakfast, Laura," Ma said. "You must mind your manners, even if we are 100 miles from anywhere." Pa said mildly,
"It's only 40 miles to Independence, Caroline, and no doubt there's a neighbor or so nearer than that."
40 miles, then," Ma agreed. "But whether or no, it isn't good manners to sing at table, or when we're eating," she added, because there was no table. There was only the enormous, empty prairie, with grasses blowing in waves of light and shadow across it, and the great blue sky above it, and birds flying up from it and singing with joy because the sun was rising. And on the whole enormous prairie, there was no sign of any other human being had ever been there. In all that space of land and sky stood the small, lonely, covered wagon. And close to it sat Pa and Ma and Laura and Mary and baby Carrie, eating their breakfasts. The mustangs munched their corn, and Jack sat still, trying hard not to beg. Laura was not allowed to feed him while she ate, but she saved bits for him. And Ma made a big pancake for him, of the last of the batter. Rabbits were everywhere in the grass, and thousands of prairie chickens, but Jack could not hunt his breakfast that day. Pa was going hunting, and Jack must guard the camp. First, Pa put Pet and Patty on their picket lines. Then he took the wooden tub from the side of the wagon and filled it with water from the creek. Ma was going to do the washing. Then Pa stuck his sharp hatchet in his belt. He hung his powder horn beside the hatchet. He put the patch box and the bullet pouch in his pocket, and he took his gun on his arm. He said to Ma,
"Take your time, Caroline. We won't move the wagon till we want to. We've got all the time there is."
He went away. For a little while, they could see the upper part of him above the tall grasses, going away and growing smaller. Then he went out of sight, and the prairie was empty. Mary and Laura washed the dishes while Ma made the beds in the wagon. They put the clean dishes neatly in their box. They picked up every scattered twig and put it in the fire. They stacked the wood against a wagon wheel. Then everything about the camp was tidy. Ma brought the wooden pannikin of soft soap from the wagon. She kilted up her skirts and rolled up her sleeves, and she knelt by the tub on the grass. She washed sheets and pillowcases and white underthings. She washed dresses and shirts, and she rinsed them in clear water and spread them on the clean grass to dry in the sun. Mary and Laura were exploring. They must not go far from the wagon, but it was fun to run through the tall grass in the sunshine and wind. Huge rabbits bounded away before them. Birds fluttered up and settled again. The tiny dicky birds were everywhere, and their tiny nests were in the tall weeds. And everywhere were little brown striped gophers. These little creatures looked soft as velvet. They had bright round eyes and crinkling noses and wee paws. They popped out of holes in the ground and stood up to look at Mary and Laura. Their hind legs folded under their haunches, and their little paws folded tight to their chests, and they looked exactly like bits of dead wood sticking out of the ground, only their bright eyes glittered. Mary and Laura wanted to catch one to take to Ma. Again and again they almost had one. The gopher would stand perfectly still until you were sure you had him this time. Then just as you touched him, he wasn't there. There was only his round hole in the ground. Laura ran and couldn't catch one. Mary sat perfectly still beside a hole, waiting for one to come up, and just beyond her reach, Gopher scampered merrily, and Gopher sat up and looked at her, but not one ever came out of that hole. Once a shadow floated across the grass, and every gopher vanished. A hawk was sailing overhead. It was so close that Laura saw its cruel round eye turned downward to look at her. She saw its sharp beak and its savage claws curling, ready to pounce. But the hawk saw nothing but Laura and Mary and round, empty holes in the ground. It sailed away, looking somewhere else for its dinner. Then all the little gophers came up again. It was nearly noon then. The sun was almost overhead. So Laura and Mary picked flowers from the weeds, and they took the flowers to Ma instead of a gopher. Ma was folding the dry clothes. The little panties and petticoats were whiter than snow, warm from the sun and smelling like the grass. Ma laid them in the wagon and took the flowers. She admired equally the flowers that Laura gave her and the flowers that Mary gave her, and she put them together in a tin cup full of water. She set them on the wagon step to make the camp pretty. Then she split 2 cold corn cakes and spread them with molasses. She gave one to Mary and one to Laura. That was their dinner, and it was very good. "Where is a papoose, Ma?" Laura asked. "Don't speak with your mouth full, Laura," said Ma. So Laura chewed and swallowed, and she said, "I want to see a papoose." "Mercy on us," Ma said. "Whatever makes you want to see Indians? We will see enough of them, more than we want to, I wouldn't wonder." "They won't hurt us, would they?" Mary asked. Mary was always good. She never spoke with her mouth full. "No," Ma said. "Don't get such an idea into your head." "Why don't you like Indians, Ma?" Laura asked, and she caught a drip of molasses with her tongue. "I just don't like them, and don't lick your fingers, Laura," said Ma. "This is Indian country, isn't it?" Laura said. "What did we come to their country for if you don't like them?" Ma said she didn't know whether this was Indian country or not. She didn't know where the Kansas line was, but whether or no the Indians would not be here long. Pa had word from a man in Washington that the Indian Territory would be open to settlement soon. It might already be open to settlement. They could not know because Washington was so far away. Then Ma took the sad iron out of the wagon and heated it by the fire. She sprinkled a dress for Mary and a dress for Laura, and a little dress for baby Carrie and her own sprigged calico. She spread a blanket and a sheet on the wagon seat, and she ironed the dresses. Baby Carrie slept in the wagon. Laura and Mary and Jack lay on the shady grass beside it, because now the sunshine was hot. Jack's mouth was open and his red tongue hang out. His eyes blinked sleepily. Ma hummed softly to herself while the iron smoothed all the wrinkles out of the little dresses. All around them, to the very edge of the world, there was nothing but grasses waving in the wind. Far overhead, a few white puffs of cloud sailed in the thin blue air. Laura was very happy. The wind sang a low, rustling song on the grass. Grasshoppers rasping quivered up from all the immense prairie. A buzzing came faintly from all the trees in the creek bottoms. But all these sounds met a great, warm, happy silence. Laura had never seen a place she liked so much as this place. She didn't know she had gone to sleep until she woke up. Jack was on his feet, wagging his stump tail. The sun was low, and Pa was coming across the prairie. Laura jumped up and ran, and his long shadow stretched to meet her in the waving grasses. He held up the game in his hand for her to see. He had a rabbit, the largest rabbit she had ever seen, and 2 plump prairie hens. Laura jumped up and down and clapped her hands and squealed. Then she caught hold of his other sleeve and hippity-hopped through the tall grasses beside him.
This country's cram-jammed with game,
He told her.
I saw 50 deer if I saw one, and antelope, squirrels, rabbits, birds of all kinds. The creek's full of fish,
He said to Ma.
I tell you, Caroline, there's everything we want here. We can live like kings.
That was a wonderful supper. They sat by the campfire and ate the tender, savory, flavory meat till they could eat no more. When at last Laura set down her plate, she sighed with contentment. She didn't want anything more in the world. The last color was fading from the enormous sky, and all the level land was shadowy. The warmth of the fire was pleasant because the night wind was cool. Phoebe birds called sadly from the woods down by the creek. For a little while, a mockingbird sang. Then the stars came out, and the birds were still. Softly, Pa's fiddle sang in the starlight. Sometimes he sang a little, and sometimes the fiddle sang alone. Sweet and thin and far away, the fiddle went on singing. None knew thee but to love thee, thou dear one of my heart. The large, bright stars hung down from the sky. Lower and lower they came, quivering with music. Laura gasped, and Ma said quickly, What is it, Laura? She asked, and Laura whispered, The stars were singing. You've been asleep, Ma said. It is only the fiddle, and it's time little girls were in bed. She undressed Laura in the firelight and put her nightgown on and tied her nightcap and tucked her into bed. But the fiddle was still singing in the starlight. The night was full of music, and Laura was sure that part of it came from the great, bright stars swinging so low above the prairie. Little House on the Prairie series by Laura Ingalls Wilder. Book 2, Little House on the Prairie. Chapter 5, The House on the Prairie. Laura and Mary were up next morning earlier than the sun. They ate their breakfast of cornmeal mush with prairie hen gravy and hurried to help Ma wash the dishes. Pa was loading everything else into the wagon and hitching up Pet and Patty. When the sun rose, they were driving on across the prairie. There was no road now. Pet and Patty waded through the grasses, and the wagon left behind it only the tracks of its wheels. Before noon, Pa said,
Whoa!
The wagon stopped.
Here we are, Caroline,
he said.
Right here we'll build our house.
Laura and Mary scrambled over the feed box and dropped to the ground in a hurry. All around them there was nothing but grassy prairie spreading to the edge of the sky. Quite near them, to the north, the creek bottoms lay below the prairie. Some darker green treetops showed, and beyond them bits of the rim of earthen bluffs held up the prairie's grasses. Far away to the east, a broken line of different greens lay on the prairie, and Pa said that was the river.
That's the Verdigris River,
he said, pointing it out to Ma. Right away, he and Ma began to unload the wagon. They took out everything and piled it on the ground. Then they took off the wagon cover and put it over the pile. Then they took even the wagon box off, while Laura and Mary and Jack watched. The wagon had been home for a long time. Now there was nothing left of it but the four wheels and the parts that connected them. Pet and Patty were still hitched to the tongue. Pa took a bucket and his axe, and sitting on this skeleton wagon, he drove away. He drove right down into the prairie, out of sight. Where's Pa going? Laura asked, and Ma said, He's going to get a load of logs from the creek bottoms. It was strange and frightening to be left without the wagon on the high prairie. The land and the sky seemed too large, and Laura felt small. She wanted to hide and be still in the tall grass, like a little prairie chicken. But she didn't. She helped Ma, while Mary sat on the grass and minded baby Carrie. First, Laura and Ma made the beds under the wagon cover tent. Then Ma arranged the boxes and bundles, while Laura pulled all the grass from a space in front of the tent. They made a bare place for the fire. They couldn't start the fire until Pa brought wood. There was nothing more to do, so Laura explored a little. She did not go far from the tent, but she found a queer little kind of tunnel in the grass. You'd never notice it if you looked across the waving grass tops, but when you came to it, there was a narrow, straight, hard path down between the grass stems. It went out into the endless prairie. Laura went along it a little way. She went slowly and more slowly, and then she stood still and felt queer, so she turned around and came back quickly. When she looked over her shoulder, there wasn't anything there, but she hurried. When Pa came riding back on a load of logs, Laura told him about the path. He said he had seen it yesterday.
It's some old trail,
he said. That night by the fire, Laura asked again when she would see a papoose, but Pa didn't know. He said you never saw Indians unless they wanted you to see them. He had seen Indians when he was a boy in New York State, but Laura never had. She knew they were wild men with red skins, and their hatchets were called tomahawks. Pa knew all about wild animals, so he must know about wild men, too. Laura thought he would show her a papoose someday, just as he had shown her fawns and little bears and wolves. For days, Pa hauled logs. He made 2 piles of them, one for the house and one for the stable. There began to be a road where he drove back and forth to the creek bottoms, and at night on their new picket lines, Pet and Patty ate the grass till it was short and stubby all around the log piles. Pa began the house first. He paced off the sides of it on the ground. Then with his spade, he dug a shallow little hollow along 2 sides of that space. Into these hollows, he rolled 2 of the biggest logs. They were sound, strong logs because they must hold up the house. They were called sills. Then Pa chose 2 more strong, big logs, and he rolled these logs onto the ends of the sills so that they made a hollow square. Now, with his axe, he cut a wide, deep notch near the end of each log. He cut these notches out of the top of the log, but with his eye he measured the sills, and he cut the notches so that they would fit around half of the sill. When the notches were cut, he rolled the log over, and the notches fitted down over the sill. That finished the foundation of the house. It was 1 log high. The sills were half buried in the ground, and the logs on their ends fitted snugly to the ground. At the corners where they crossed, the notches let them fit together so that they were no thicker than 1 log, and the 2 ends stuck out beyond the notches. Next day, Pa began the walls. From each side he rolled up a log, and he notched its ends so that it fitted down over the end logs. Then he rolled up logs from the ends and notched them so that they fitted down over the side logs. Now the whole house was 2 logs high. The logs fit solidly together at the corners, but no log is ever perfectly straight, and all logs are bigger at one end than at the other, so cracks were left between them all along the walls. But that did not matter, because Pa would chink those cracks. All by himself, he built the house 3 logs high. Then Ma helped him. Pa lifted one end of the log onto the wall. Then Ma held it while he lifted the other end. He stood up on the wall to cut the notches, and Ma helped roll and hold the log while he settled it near where it should make the corner perfectly square. So, log by log, they built the walls higher, till they were pretty high, and Laura couldn't get over them any more. She was tired of watching Pa and Ma build the house, and she went into the tall grass exploring. Suddenly she heard Pa shout,
"Let go! Get out from under!"
The big, heavy log was sliding. Pa was trying to hold his end of it to keep it from falling on Ma. He couldn't. It crashed down. Laura saw Ma huddled on the ground. She got to Ma almost as quickly as Pa did. Pa knelt down and called Ma in a dreadful voice, and Ma gasped, "I'm all right." The log was on her foot. Pa lifted the log, and Ma pulled her foot from under it. Pa felt her to see if any bones were broken.
"Move your arms," he said. "Is your back hurt? Can you turn your head?"
Ma moved her arms and turned her head.
"Thank God,"
Pa said. He helped Ma to sit up. She said again, "I'm all right, Charles. It's just my foot." Quickly, Pa took off her shoe and stocking. He felt her foot all over, moving the ankle and the instep and every toe.
"Does it hurt much?"
he asked. Ma's face was gray and her mouth was a tight line. "Not much," she said.
"No bones broken,"
said Pa.
"It's only a bad sprain."
Ma said cheerfully, "Well, a sprain's soon mended. Don't be so upset, Charles."
"I blame myself,"
said Pa.
"I should have used skids."
He helped Ma to the tent. He built up the fire and heated water. When the water was as hot as Ma could bear, she put her swollen foot into it. It was providential that the foot was not crushed. Only a little hollow in the ground had saved it. Pa kept pouring more hot water into the tub in which Ma's foot was soaking. Her foot was red from the heat, and the puffed ankle began to turn purple. Ma took her foot out of the water and bound strips of rag tightly around and around the ankle. "I can manage," she said. She could not get her shoe on, but she tied more rags around her foot and she hobbled on it. She got supper as usual, only a little more slowly, but Pa said she could not help to build the house until her ankle was well. He hewed out skids. These were long, flat slabs. One end rested on the ground and the other end rested on the log wall. He was not going to lift any more logs. He and Ma would roll them up these skids. But Ma's ankle was not well yet. When she unwrapped it in the evenings to soak it in hot water, it was all purple and black and green and yellow. The house must wait. Then one afternoon, Pa came merrily whistling up the creek road. They had not expected him home from hunting so soon. As soon as he saw them, he shouted,
"Good news!"
They had a neighbor only 2 miles away on the other side of the creek. Pa had met him in the woods. They were going to trade work, and that would make it easier for everyone.
"He's a bachelor," said Pa, "and he says he can get along without a house better than you and the girls can, so he's going to help me first. Then as soon as he gets his logs ready, I'll go over and help him."
They need not wait any longer for the house, and Ma need not do any more work on it.
"How do you like that, Caroline?"
Pa asked joyfully, and Ma said, "That's good, Charles. I'm glad." Early next morning, Mr. Edwards came. He was lean and tall and brown. He bowed to Ma and called her ma'am politely. But he told Laura that he was a wildcat from Tennessee. He wore tall boots and a ragged jumper and a coonskin cap, and he could spit tobacco juice farther than Laura had ever imagined that anyone could spit tobacco juice. He could hit anything he spit at, too. Laura tried and tried, but she could never spit so far or so well as Mr. Edwards could. He was a fast worker. In one day, he and Pa built those walls as high as Pa wanted them. They joked and sang while they worked, and their axes made the chips fly. On top of the walls, they set up a skeleton roof of slender poles. Then in the south wall, they cut a tall hole for a door, and in the west wall and the east wall, they cut square holes for windows. Laura couldn't wait to see the inside of the house. As soon as the tall hole was cut, she ran inside. Everything was striped there. Stripes of sunshine coming through the cracks in the west wall, and stripes of shadow came down from the poles overhead. The stripes of shade and sunshine were all across Laura's hands and her arms and her bare feet. And through the cracks between the logs, she could see stripes of prairie, the sweet smell of the prairie mixed with the sweet smell of cut wood. Then, as Pa cut away the logs and made the window hole in the west wall, chunks of sunshine came in. When he finished, a big block of sunshine lay on the ground inside the house. Around the door hole and the window holes, Pa and Mr. Edwards nailed thin slabs against the cut ends of the logs, and the house was finished, all but the roof. The walls were solid and the house was large, much larger than the tent. It was a nice house. Mr. Edwards said he would go home now, but Pa and Ma said he must stay for supper. Ma had cooked an especially good supper because they had company. There was stewed jackrabbit with white flour dumplings and plenty of gravy. There was a steaming hot, thick cornbread flavored with bacon fat. There was molasses to eat on the cornbread, but because this was a company supper, they did not sweeten their coffee with molasses. Ma brought out the little paper sack of pale brown store sugar. Mr. Edwards said he surely did appreciate that supper. Then Pa brought out his fiddle. Mr. Edwards stretched out on the ground to listen. But first Pa played for Laura and Mary. He played their very favorite song, and he sang it. Laura liked it best of all because Pa's voice went down deep, deep, deeper in that song.
"Oh, I am a gypsy king. I come and go as I please. I pull my old nightcap down and take the world at my ease."
Then his voice went deep, deep down, deeper than the very oldest bullfrogs.
"Oh, I am a gypsy king."
They all laughed. Laura could hardly stop laughing. "Oh, sing it again, Pa, sing it again," she cried. before she remembered that children must be seen and not heard. Then she was quiet. Pa went on playing, and everything began to dance. Mr. Edwards rose up on one elbow, then he sat up, then he jumped up and he danced. He danced like a jumping jack in the moonlight, while Pa's fiddle kept on rollicking and his foot kept tapping the ground. And Laura's hands and Mary's hands were clapping together, and their feet were patting too. "You're the fiddlingest fool that I ever see!" Mr. Edwards shouted admiringly to Pa. He didn't stop dancing. Pa didn't stop playing. He played Money Musk, an Arkansas Traveler, Irish Washerwoman, and the Devil's Hornpipe. Baby Carrie couldn't sleep in all that music. She sat up in Ma's lap, looking at Mr. Edwards with round eyes and clapping her little hands and laughing. Even the firelight danced, and all around its edge the shadows were dancing. Only the new house stood still and quiet in the dark, till the big moon rose and shone on its gray walls and the yellow chips around it. Mr. Edwards said he must go. It was a long way back to his camp on the other side of the woods and the creek. He took his gun and said good night to Laura and Mary and Ma. He said a bachelor got mighty lonesome, and he surely had enjoyed this evening of home life. "Play, Ingalls," he said. "Play me down the road." So while he went down the creek road and out of sight, Pa played, and Pa and Mr. Edwards and Laura sang with all their might. "Old Dan Tucker was a fine old man. He's washed his face in a frying pan, combed his hair with a wagon wheel, and died of the toothache in his heel. Get out the way for old Dan Tucker. He's too late to get his supper. Supper's over and the dishes washed. Nothing left but a piece of squash. Old Dan Tucker went to town, riding a mule, leading a hound." Far over the prairie rang Pa's big voice and Laura's little one, and faintly from the creek bottom came a last whoop from Mr. Edwards. "Get out the way for old Dan Tucker. He's too late to get his supper." When Pa's fiddle stopped, they could not hear Mr. Edwards any more. Only the wind rustled in the prairie grasses. The big yellow moon was sailing high overhead. The sky was so full of light that not one star twinkled in it, and all the prairie was a shadowy mellowness. Then from the woods by the creek, a nightingale began to sing. Everything was silent, listening to the nightingale's song. The birds sang on and on. The cool wind moved over the prairie, and the song was round and clear above the grasses whispering. The sky was like a bowl of light overturned on the flat black land. The song ended. No one moved or spoke. Laura and Mary were quiet. Pa and Ma sat motionless. Only the wind stirred and the grass sighed. Then Pa lifted the fiddle to his shoulder and softly touched the bow to the strings. A few notes fell like clear drops of water into the stillness. A pause, and Pa began to play the nightingale's song. The nightingale answered him. The nightingale began to sing again. It was singing with Pa's fiddle. When the strings were silent, the nightingale went on singing. When it paused, the fiddle called to it, and it sang again. The bird and the fiddle were talking to each other in the cool night under the moon.